In this Warframe damage guide, I'm gonna tell you how to do big damage against the super high level enemies, how you can make Steel Path an absolute joke, and how it's even gonna be possible for you to take down level 10,000 enemies, which is the highest level that the game engine for enemies allows. If you played Warframe for some time, you probably know this situation. You're done with the star chart, you completed every single mission, sortie and arbitration is absolutely zero problem for your setup anymore, but once you decide to start in the Steel Path, you hit an absolute brick wall, and you're wondering what happened all of a sudden. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about today, because today I'm going to give you the best and most efficient tactics to increase your damage so much that even those uncrackable seeming enemies go down in a mere split second, and I'm going to try to explain it in a way that everybody can reproduce it for themselves. So let's get going. The first thing you can do to do more damage, and please put the torches and pitchforks down, is simply take better weapons. I know, sounds pretty crazy, Captain Obvious, but bear with me for a second. Now that we're in the day and age where Warframe is not that mysterious game anymore and there are tons of guides for everything out there, there are quite some well-informed new players who watch those guides, then start their playthrough, and when they start with Steel Path, there are some players who are just round about Mastery rank 4 to 6, and that is not necessarily the best Mastery rank range to start Steel Path at. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say it's impossible, but what I'm saying is that as you progress through the mastery ranks, the higher you get, you're gonna unlock objectively stronger weapons than are available at the lower mastery ranks. So if you find yourself at the beginning of Steel Path and you're like mastery rank 5 running around with your Gurkhata, you might want to think about maybe grinding a bit of mastery rank, at least until you're in the double digits. But I hear you say, Blacky, now that I have the mastery rank, what is a good weapon to start Steel Path with? And that's actually a very good question. I don't want to go too deep into it because that's worthy of a video on its own. If you don't want to miss out on that, make sure to leave a sub. But of course, I don't want to leave you without any advice. So what I'm going to say is a good point to start searching for a great Steel Path weapon would be the Kuva weapons that you get from Kuva Liches, the Tenet weapons that you get from Sisters of Pavos, and of course the Incarnon weapons that you can get from Cavallero on the Zeraman 10-0. These weapon categories right now are some of the best and strongest weapons in Warframe. Not saying these are the only good and Steel Path viable weapons, but if you're searching, these are definitely a great point to start. Or, and that might sound a little bit funny, if you don't like guns or you simply want it a little bit simpler, you simply go with melee weapons. Basically, every melee weapon that has between 20 and 30% in both status and crit chance, and there are a lot of melee weapons which tick those checkboxes, every of these is kind of Steel Path viable. And the fun thing is, you can simply use that build, which you're seeing right now in the background, on any of these weapons, and they're all gonna do decently well in Steel Path. It's really that brain dead. Sure, you're not gonna run to a level cap with that, but it's gonna be strong enough to get you through the entire Steel Path star chart, no problem. Next strategy for amping up your damage is to galvanize your build. If you're decently successful at star chart and sortie and arbitration, your build on your gun probably looks something like this. You have your base damage mod, your multi-shot, maybe crit chance and crit damage, then you have two 60/60s for your base element, and then you maybe have an off element and more multi-shot, or you go with Argon Scope and maybe another status chance mod to increase your crit and status even more. And as long as you're not doing Steel Path, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a build that looks kinda like this. A problem is, as we also saw in the intro, these kind of builds don't really do damage in Steel Path, they're not keeping up very well, so we need to improve that. And the first step to do that would be to replace some of these mods with the so-called galvanized versions of said mods. In this example, for instance, we can replace Split Chamber with Galvanized Chamber. And we're just getting started because there's also Galvanized Aptitude, which we can use instead of Rifle Aptitude, and Galvanized Scope, which we can use instead of Argon Scope, both having insanely nice added bonuses. In 95% of the chances, galvanized versions of mods are objectively better than the normal version. And of course, I hear you say, where am I going to get those great galvanized mods? Well, just go to the Syndicate console in your Orbiter, go to the Arbiters of Hexes, click Visit Arbiters of Hexes, and then you talk to the vendor in the Arbiters of Hexes room. Of course, you can also access that by physically going to a relay yourself and then visiting the Arbiters there. You will see he sells those galvanized mods, each one of them costing 20 Vitus Essence, which you can get from doing arbitrations. Oh, and while you're down there giving the video a like, let's look at the next strategy to amp up your damage, and that would be the use of faction mods. Faction damage mods like plus damage to Grineer or Corpus or Infested or whatever in Warframe are insanely strong, even though the percentile values on them might not seem that big of a deal, but believe me, they are. The reason that faction mods are so insanely strong is that they are calculated differently. Damage to faction and base damage is not the same. The faction damage mod is multiplicative to all the other damage that you have already on your weapon. What that means is if I have 100 damage, everything combined, all the mods combined on my weapon, 100 damage that I do with that weapon, and then I add a 50% damage to faction mod to that, that's gonna make the whole weapon deal not 100 and something, but 150 damage, meaning the effect is added at the very end of the whole damage calculation on what you've had before. To make it a bit clearer, let's look at this example in the background. We have the same weapon build on both versions of the video, just on one side I only added 60% more base damage to the base damage that's already on the weapon, and on the other side I added a primed Bane of Grineer mod which gives me 55% more damage to Grineer. And as you see with the 60% more base damage, I'm able to kill 4 of these enemies with 1 mag of my Soma. However, when I switch to the faction damage mod, you can see that I can't kill 4, but actually 6 enemies with the same amount of ammo. One quick thing about the faction damage mods, by the way, they are available for every faction and every weapon class in the game, and I would strongly recommend that you use the primed version of them and not the normal version, which are only coming in at 30% faction damage. Also, another thing worth mentioning is the damage bonus that Rhino gets from his skill Roar is also not a base damage bonus like Serration, it is actually calculated like a faction damage bonus. So if you buff up your Rhino strength and you get like 150% damage scaling with the Roar, this is like you have 3 primed Bane mods on your weapon just from that skill. So if you're dealing with high level enemies, it might be not the worst idea in the world to subsume Rhino's Roar on top of whichever Warframe you're using, so you get even more of this heavy hitting faction damage bonus. Have you noticed that we talked quite a lot about Serration as an example in this video? Because, you know, Serration always seems to be the constant among all the weapons that we have. The first thing that we always slap on every weapon is the good old base damage mod, and it seems like a god-given rule of the universe. So the next thing we're gonna do is ditching it, tossing it into the trash and never using it again. Oh my god, Blacky, how dare you say something like this? Well, let me elaborate. I know base damage bonuses on your weapon are nice, and I'm not trying to tell you to not get them. However, I want to encourage you to get them differently to free up that Serration mod slot for something from which we would benefit more. And for the base damage bonus instead, we're gonna go for the primary weapon arcanes. The 3 arcanes for primary weapons we can use would be Primary Merciless, Primary Dexterity, and Primary Deadhead. My personal favorite is Deadhead because it gives you 120% more damage for 24 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. All you need to do is getting a headshot kill, which I personally like because it's my playstyle anyway. However, if you're more of a non-headshotty playstyle person, how about maybe Primary Merciless giving you 30% more damage for 4 seconds, stacks up to 12 times, and all you need to do is get a normal kill. As you can see, if you have them on the maximum stack amount, they're gonna do exactly the same damage bonus. The only difference is how you get there and also the added bonus that you unlock if you have it at the maximum stack amount. So just pick the one arcane that seems most comfortable for your personal playstyle and insert it onto your primary weapon arcane slot. That arcane slot can be unlocked by a primary arcane adapter, which you can get from Tashin for 20, 25, 30 something steel essence that you of course get from doing steel path missions. And the great thing is, now that we have our base damage bonus covered with the arcane, we're gonna free up the serration mod slot for something like, for example, a primed faction mod that might have not fit onto our build before, and now it does, and we're gonna do a crap ton more damage than before. So all we talked about so far is how can we increase our personal damage output. But we can also look at this problem from the other side. We don't necessarily need to increase our damage output even further if we could instead make the enemies more vulnerable to the damage that we're putting out. And one great and well-known way to do that would be armor stripping. First of all, armor stripping in Warframe is a highly complex topic, and I cannot tell you all the nitty-gritty details just in this section of the video. But to put it simply, there are two main ways to reduce enemy armor. One thing would be through status effects that you inflict with your weapons, and the other way would be with Warframe abilities. Looking at the weapon side of things first, we have two elements that can reduce enemy armor, and that would be corrosive and heat. Both work kind of differently in that corrosive does a little bit of armor stripping with every corrosive status effect that you proc onto an enemy up till the maximum of 10, whereas heat reduces the enemy armor to half absolutely with the first heat proc that you do. However, subsequent heat procs don't change anything about that, so going down to half is the best heat can ever do. So the question would be, which one of these are we gonna use for armor stripping? In this video in the background, I'm gonna attack an enemy with a melee weapon which has the same build in every version of this video. One time I'm gonna reduce the armor by 10 corrosive procs, one time I'm gonna halve the armor with just one heat proc, and the other time I'm gonna reduce the armor completely with a Warframe ability. And as you can see, our attack does more damage to the enemy when we have 10 corrosive procs compared to when we're just using a heat proc. But why is it then that in all high-level builds that you see on YouTube, they're always using heat for armor stripping and never corrosive? Well, the thing is that to make enemies more vulnerable to damage, it is very common meta, and you're probably aware of that, to use viral as a status effect because it makes the enemy more vulnerable to damage. To get viral onto your weapon, you need cold and toxin. You also need toxin in combination with electricity to get corrosive. Meaning, if your weapon doesn't have innate viral or corrosive damage already, it is absolutely impossible to get corrosive and viral both onto the weapon because they're both utilizing toxin. But of course, armor cannot only be reduced with your weapons, your warframes can do the same thing as well. One way of doing that would be with corrosive projection, the aura mod, which you can install onto your warframe, but the biggest armor strip in the entire game are of course warframe abilities. There are quite some and I don't want to get into all of them, just my two personal favorites would be Terrify from Necros and the Shield Bash from Styanax. With enough ability strength on your build, both of these abilities are absolutely capable of stripping away the entire enemy armor from the enemies affected, so they are insanely strong when it comes to armor reduction, which you can by the way also see in the footage in the background, where I absolutely obliterate this enemy as soon as all the armor is gone. But let's talk about something else. As you can remember just a minute ago, I was talking about why viral is such a super great element for Steel Path, so the logical consequence seems to be simply slapping as much viral on your weapon as you physically can. And while a lot of players surely do that and they get some decent outcomes with this, actually it's not ideal. While viral has a great status effect, making enemies more vulnerable to your damage, the viral element itself usually does not get any proper damage bonuses against most types of enemy health. So, can we do anything to fix that? And the actually very simple solution to that is to simply outsource doing the viral effects to another weapon. In this way, you can put the element that gets the damage bonus against the enemy faction on your primary weapon so you do more damage, while at the same time you have another weapon specialized on dealing just the viral effects for you. This strategy is called priming, and the weapons that you use for that are the primers. So to optimize this build, you can go and take away the viral from your main weapon and also maybe take away the heat because you also don't need the armor strip on this weapon anymore, and instead use, if you're going against Kengineer for example, actual corrosive on your primary damage dealing weapon, because corrosive, as we all know, gets 75% damage bonus against Grineer's ferrite armor. That's nice. And instead, you're gonna put the viral, you're gonna put the heat, and whatever you like on your secondary weapon, and also put some more status chance or multi-shot mods on this, because remember, you're only gonna care about that you have all the elements you need, and that you have as high of a status chance as possible. My two favorite secondary weapons for priming are the Kuvanukor and the Epitaph. They're both extremely great because they both have the ability to hit multiple enemies at once. The Epitaph shoots an explosive projectile, which I don't think I have to explain any further, and the Kuvanukor shoots a ray that splits up and hits multiple enemies at once. Also, both of these weapons have a large variety in the types of different elements that they can have. So, for example, if you use Condition Overload on your melee build, which gives you more base damage, the more different status effects the enemy has, which is also the side effect of Galvanized status chance mods on primary weapons, you can get creative and not only slap viral and heat on your primary weapon, you can go and slap whatever element you desire and don't really need onto them, simply so that you get a lot of different status effects onto your enemy, meaning your primary source of damage, your primary damage dealing weapons with those mods that give you more base damage depending on how many status effects are on the enemy is gonna do crazy tons of damage. As you can also see in the background right now, there's a footage from me fighting an Archon having I don't know how many status effects on the Archon, and you can see his health is absolutely melting away. And by the way, I think I don't even have a single viral proc on him, and I still cut through him like a hot knife through butter. But if you've ever used a primer weapon yourself, what's your favorite primer? Is it also the Kuvanukor or the Epitaph, or are you using something completely different? Maybe a melee, maybe even a primary weapon? Let me know in the comments down below, so maybe I can find something that I also like and try that out in the future. And the next strategy on our list is just a little side note, however I still didn't want to leave it unmentioned, and that is companions. As we just elaborated, of course, viral is very important, and if you were to use a Panzer Valpaphyla with the viral quilt skill, the Valpaphyla will actually proc a crap ton of viral onto all the enemies in the room, meaning you don't even have to go and put that on your weapon anymore as long as you have the Valpaphyla as your companion. Also, another nice choice would be maybe using a Sentinel with the Hellstrom weapon equipped, because the Hellstrom is a rocket launcher, it does a bit of AoE, and it has a very high status chance, meaning, well, yeah, you could use it as a status primer on top of the status primer that you're equipped with yourself. And these are just two examples. What I want to say by this is, don't underestimate your companion, you can actually effectively use them in combat. But what if you simply don't want to go into all the nitty-gritty weapon building? What if you don't have half of the mods on our list, or you don't want to grind for arcanes and you don't want to buy primed faction mods from Barrow? Isn't there a very simple, very brain-dead way to kill super high-level enemies without even having to do anything or having to have any proper equipment? Well, funnily, and because it's Warframe of course, there is. And what I'm talking about right here is scaling damage. There are some Warframes in the game that have abilities whose damage is scaling with enemy level, just like the enemy damage that they're dealing to you. And some very prominent skills that do that would be, for example, Mallet from Octavia, dealing more damage to enemies the more damage the Mallet itself takes, meaning higher level enemies doing higher level damage to the Mallet means the Mallet does higher level damage back to the enemies, scales very nicely, and is easily able to clear entire rooms of level 10,000 enemies if you're 7 hours into a survival mission. Another great choice would be Reeve from Revenant. As long as you put enough viral effects on the enemy and then hit them with Reeve, they're gonna die in one hit, no matter the level. So you can also clear level 10,000 enemies with Reeve by Revenant, and all you need is some viral procs. By the way, if you want to see this Revenant Reeve build in action, click the cards up there because I already have a video on this specific setup on the channel. And if you simply love the game playing itself without you having to do basically anything, you could go and use Zaku with the skill where, you know, Zaku has those flying weapons next to them. They're doing also more damage the higher the enemies were that you took the weapons from. So this is also a great way to scale up to very high levels. But these 3 are not the only frames. There are also other skills and other warframes that scale very nicely with higher enemy levels, but I simply don't want to mention all of them. Maybe you want to leave your favorite in the comments so we can all enjoy it, or maybe you want to go and test for yourself. I didn't want to get too deep into all those different warframe builds because it would blow up the video too much, but be assured there are more high-level builds to come on this channel showing you how those specific frame builds work, so if you're interested in that, you might want to think about joining the crew. But now, let's finally talk about the absolute, very craziest strategy that is currently possible in the game to amp your builds up into insanely high levels, and that would be double dipping. You might have heard about it, you might not, because double dipping is somewhat of a niche topic that most players only look into when they're going really high level, because before that it's simply not necessary. But I'm trying to do my best right now to explain what double dipping actually is. By the way, shout out to all these nice guys on Reddit who explained it to me so I can explain it to you. Double dipping in Warframe is the way that damage is calculated if you do damage over time through status effects while having damage to faction mods installed on the weapon with which you deal those status effects. Let's make a very simplified example right here. Imagine we're dealing 100 damage with our weapon with the full build and everything to the enemy, and these 100 damage deal a heat proc. As we all know, a heat status effect burns the enemies, dealing damage over time every second for 6 seconds. I know this is not exactly the way that damage transition into damage over time is actually calculated in the game, but for simplicity's sake, let's just assume for this example, our 100 damage causing the heat effect leads to 100 damage taken every single second over the 6-second period that the effect is on. If we now go and add a damage to Galvanized mod on this weapon setup, let's just assume it's gonna be plus 50%, we hit the enemy again, causing a heat effect, and of course, with the plus 50% damage to faction mod, we're now gonna do 150 heat damage with our initial hit. So far, nothing new. So what you logically assume would be happening right now is this enemy would take 150 damage over time every second. But this is where the weird double dipping calculation shenanigans begin, because if you have a faction damage mod in the mix, the faction damage is applied twice. First with the initial hit, which right here gives us 50 more damage, but then every damage over time tick will get another 50% more damage, meaning the 150 caused our damage over time, but there's gonna be 50% damage addition on top of those 150 ticks for every second, meaning 225 damage every second. And if we now assume that maybe we use Roar from Rhino on our setup with the helmet system, we have Roar that gives us, let's say, 100% more damage to faction, and the faction damage mod giving us another 50%, meaning we have a total of plus 150% damage to Galvanized. Our initial hit would be doing 250 heat damage, and then we would have another plus 150% on the 250 for every damage tick over time, leading to 625 damage every second over the period of 6 seconds. I know these were a lot of numbers, but I hope you get what I mean by this. If you manage to build a weapon in a way that it does a whole lot of damage over time effects, and then you slap on faction mods into the mix, you're gonna see those weird scenes which you also see in the background right now, where it seems like you're not doing any damage originally until the first damage tick from the damage over time effect hits, and that blasts the enemy away, sometimes even in just one hit. By the way, this not only works for heat, it also works for other damage over time effects like Slash and Toxin, and this is what the super high level, the level cap players like to use, because if there's a level 10,000 enemy, your weapon naturally wouldn't be able to break this big defense, but with the double dipping shenanigans, it's actually possible to deal a whole lot of damage over time effects, then wait for the ticks to come, and they're gonna do crazy amounts of damage that are even able to slay those very high level enemies. Of course, all these tactics are just some very generalized tactics. There are individual builds for individual weapons and individual warframes that are working completely different than any of what I said in this video. And in a game with hundreds of different weapons and 50 different warframes, of course I cannot cover every build for every weapon and every warframe in this video right here. So if you have any loadout suggestions that would also be nice, make sure to leave them in the comments down below. Maybe I can look into these things in a future dedicated video to said warframe. And now that you know how to deal big time damage in Steel Path and make those enemies cry in fear as soon as they see you on the horizon, you might also think, well, now that I do damage, there's another problem. I die a whole lot in Steel Path because not only are you hitting like a truck right now after this video, the Steel Path enemies are also gonna hit you like a truck by default. And guess what? I also have a video on exactly that topic, how you can survive everything in Warframe, even the level 10,000 level cap enemies, no problem whatsoever. Make sure to check that out next if you have the feeling that you die too often. Until then, much fun and of course, good loot.